Okay, how's it going, everybody? So today I'm going to read. Let's see. This book is by Norman Hampson. It's called "The First European Revolution from 1776 to 1815," and this is basically, let's see, about this book. The most significant changes during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period were in the realm of ideas. The French Revolution ended the era of aristocratic conservatism, enlightened rationalism, and sentimental deism. By the time of Napoleon's eclipse, idealist philosophy and romanticism, both of which assumed disharmony and national conflict, had replaced these attitudes. In this book, Norman Hampson, professor of history at York University, shows that his ideological shift, rather than manifestations of class rivalry, explains the actions of the French revolutionaries. Its perspective also throws new light on the impact of revolutionary and Napoleonic France on the rest of Europe. So yeah, okay, this is okay. There we are, back to stereo now. 1 second. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this. The first chapter here is called The Intellectual Climate. Let's go ahead. In 1748, Montesquieu published his greatest work, De l'Esprit de l'Homme. 3 years later, Diderot brought out the first 2 volumes of the Encyclopédie au Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences des arts et des métiers. So, I don't speak French. I'm probably really mispronouncing everything, any French word in here. But, yeah, let's get back into this. It was while going to visit Diderot in Vincennes-Gaulle in 1749 that Rousseau was overwhelmed by a sudden vision of the nature of man and society that was to transform his own life, and by winning him the essay prize of the Dijon Academy, to set him on the road to fame. The 3 points of view represented by Montesquieu, Diderot, and Rousseau were to dominate European thought for the second half of the 18th century, providing the terms of reference by which men interpreted the past and conceived the future, and setting goals which those with political power sought to attain. Familiarity with these attitudes is therefore a necessary preliminary to an understanding of how contemporaries saw themselves and their environment, and how they regarded the political decisions which they took. I must emphasize from the start, however, that this chapter does not pretend to analyze the actual philosophies of Montesquieu, Diderot, and Rousseau. These brilliant and complicated men transcended any system, reacted upon each other, and responded to the climate of the age, before going on to modify it by their genius. What follows is a simplified and schematic analysis of the kind of attitude with which each of them came to be associated. As such, it does not correspond exactly to the point of view of any man in particular. There is an obvious danger in inventing systems of this kind and then using them to interpret events. But without some principle of interpretation, the events themselves have no meaning. The criterion by which the present method must be judged is its ability to communicate to a 20th century reader an understanding of the history of the period in terms which the actors themselves would have recognized as valid. Insofar as it succeeds in doing so, an intellectual oversimplification becomes a pragmatically valid tool. Montesquieu. The school of thought associated with Montesquieu, and also the Vico in Italy and Burke in England, emphasized that man was a social being, whose ideas, beliefs, and language were given to him by the multiple social groups within which he developed. Any human society was therefore an organism whose parts acquired meaning and viability only in relation to the whole. The individual was in the first instance the product of many conditioning forces. As Montesquieu put it, men are governed by various things: climate, religion, laws, the principles of the government, and the example of past deeds, habits, and manners. Some of these factors, such as climate, were beyond human control, or others were at once the cause and the effect of human activity. Men helped to create the environment by which they were in turn conditioned. To quote the Dutch proverb, God made the world, but the Dutch made Holland. Having made it, however, the economic and perhaps the political and even religious beliefs of the Dutch were inescapably influenced by the kind of environment which their own actions had created for them. Inevitably, Montesquieu found the problem of free will virtually insoluble. He maintained that laws were the necessary relationships, which are determined by the nature of things. But like almost all his contemporaries, he could not shake off a belief in an underlying universal code of moral values. However strongly his arguments might seem to point in the opposite direction, nature was, for him, not merely the sum of the conditioning factors, but also a moral imperative. In a magnificent passage, typical of the nobility of the best 18th century thought, he sacrificed consistency to humanity. Quote, I was about to say that torture might be suitable in despotic states, where everything that inspires fear has a more important part in the dynamic force of government. I was going to say that slaves in Greece and Rome, but I hear the voice of nature crying out against me. Such a view of society was essentially pluralist. The individual was the point of intersection of many circles. The international community of mankind, the state, the church, the family, and so on. Each of these conferred its own rights and obligation, and any attempt by a single body, such as the state, to assert a claim to total obedience was both tyrannous and unnatural. This kind of attitude was well illustrated later in the century by Priestley's hostility to the state control of education. Quote, one method of education, therefore, would produce one kind of man, but the great excellence of human nature consists in the variety of which it is capable. The various character of the Athenians was certainly preferable to the uniform character of the Spartans. End quote. Priestley's repeated preference of Athens to Sparta was no mere classical embroidery. In one sense, the 18th century debate was between Plato and Aristotle. In another, it was between Athens and Sparta, as the 18th century saw them. One corollary of the kind of pluralism that Montesquieu advocated was the belief that rights were founded on prescription, and generally belonged to a corporate body, church, estate of the realm, or charter town, rather than to the individual. Even when individually exercised, as in the case of seigneurial privileges, the rights were inherent in the lordship of the manor, and not in the man who happened to be profiting from them at any given time. Priestley therefore defined as, quote, England's standing deputies, end quote, the king, the hereditary lords, and the electors of the House of Commons. These electors enjoyed their franchise by traditional prescription, and not by any individual right of representation as citizens. One must add, however, that in practice, the school of Montesquieu, distinguished by its common sense rather than its consistency, did reserve to individuals an ultimate right of conscientious objection in the name of abstract principle. The political implications of beliefs of this kind depended to some extent on how satisfied one was with the existing state of one's own society. There was an inherent tendency for the emphasis on prescription and the social origin of rights to be used in defense of the status quo. Montesquieu himself, writing of the existence of a separate ecclesiastical jurisdiction, said, quote, the question is not to determine whether it was right to establish it, but whether it has been established, whether it forms part of the laws of a country and is everywhere relative to them. End quote. If, however, one were dissatisfied with the society in which one lived, it was not difficult to present this society as the unnatural distortion of some traditional norm. As the English parliamentaries had claimed in the 17th century from the Reformation to the French Revolution, change was often justified as a return to the past. Montesquieu and Burke, whose outlook had a good deal in common, adopted different political attitudes, because Burke was on the whole satisfied with the political system, of which he was part, and Montesquieu was not. For the latter, monarchies become corrupt when the prerogatives of corporations and the privileges of towns are gradually taken away. Monarchy itself perishes, i.e., becomes despotic, when the ruler, relating everything exclusively to himself, summons the state to his capital, the capital to his court, and the court to his own person. This was obviously intended as a criticism of the unitary centralizing policy of Louis XIV, which had destroyed legitimate monarchy in France. The need was therefore to restore the lost pluralistic balance by restoring the influence of what Montesquieu called intermediate bodies. In France, this pointed towards an aristocratic reaction that would reinvigorate the existing provincial estates and restore those which had lapsed in the 17th century, and also uphold the right claimed by the appeal courts, or parliaments, to exercise some kind of supervision over royal legislation, since the states and parliaments were both dominated by the nobility, and Montesquieu specifically recognized the noble code of honor as one of the necessary restraints on royal power, it was not unreasonable to present him as the spokesman of the aristocratic reaction. His main concern, however, was not with privilege as such, but with safeguarding individual freedom by preventing an excessive concentration of political power in any hands. He was enthusiastic in his praise of the British Constitution, which he misinterpreted as including a House of Commons representing commoners as individual citizens. In this sense, he was to be acclaimed in 1789 as the prophet of reform, and probably exercised more influence than any other writer on the various constitutions of revolutionary France. For Burke, the constitutional question had been settled once and for all in 1688. His interpretation of the final overthrow of the Stuarts was the starting point of his whole political system. What we did was in truth and substance, and in a constitutional light, a revolution, not made but prevented. The nation kept the same ranks, the same orders, the same privileges, the same franchises, the same rule for property, the same subordination." End quote. Having thus conveniently maintained the principle of historical continuity, he was free to present the status quo as guaranteed by prescription. The peculiar evolution of British government and society allowed him the freedom denied to continental writers, to defend the political and civil liberties of the individual as an inheritance rather than an abstract universal right. You will observe that from the Magna Charta to the Declaration of Right, it has been the uniform policy of our Constitution to claim and assert our liberties as an entailed inheritance derived to us from our forefathers, and to be transmitted to our posterity as an estate specially belonging to the people of this kingdom, without any reference whatever to an other more general or prior right. By this means, our liberty becomes a noble freedom. It carries on imposing in majestic aspect. It has a pedigree in illustrating ancestors. It has its bearings in its ensign's armorial. Okay, so that was, I think that was a quote, yeah. It was a special nature of British society in which nobility of birth conferred few direct privileges and cut no deep cleavage through the ranks of polite society that enabled Burke to claim with more plausibility than would have been possible across the Channel. A true natural aristocracy is not a separate interest in the state, or separable from it. To give, therefore, no more importance in the social order to such descriptions of men than that of so many units is a horrible usurpation. End quote. The wars against revolutionary France consolidated the hold of Burke's views over British opinion, since they seemed to offer ground for opposing the revolutionary movements on the continent while retaining one's constitutional self-respect at home. As late as 1831, Coleridge was still opposing the Reform Bill on the same principles. Ministers have appealed directly to the argument of the greater number of voices, no matter whether the utterers were drunk or sober, as if sobriety had been the distinguishing characteristic of the traditionally enfranchised, competent or not competent. They have done the utmost in their power to raise out the sacred principle in politics of a representation of interest and to introduce the mad and barbarizing scheme of a delegation of individuals. You will nowhere in our parliamentary records find the miserable sophism of the rights of man. No, they were too wise for that. They took good care to refer their claims to custom and prescription. This argument was, of course, peculiarly insular, and continental theorists who appealed to Burke could do so only in defense of an entailed inheritance, which implied special privileges for those of noble birth, and denied that measure of civil political liberty which, for Burke, was the justification of his case. Both Montesquieu and Burke thought in primary political and economic terms. German writers, especially Herder in the last quarter of the century, gave a new cultural depth to this conception of man as a product of his society. Each society developed what we should now call, quote, a culture pattern, end quote, of its own based on its language. Language, with its special ambiguities and involuntary associations of ideas, was an evolving inheritance from the past that conditioned the ways of thinking of the present. Quote, each nation, said Herder, speaks in the manner it thinks and thinks in the manner it speaks. The vehicle of this culture was the Volk, a cultural rather than a social or economic entity. The Volk consisted of the people who shared a common linguistic civilization, at once wider and narrower than the state. In the case of Germany, it excluded the cosmopolitan French-speaking nobility at one end of the spectrum and the rootless rabble at the other. It also comprehended people of Germanic culture under alien political rule. The individual was what he was because he had grown up as a member of his particular people. He could not meaningfully claim abstract rights as an individual, since the very terms in which he formulated his claim would be a reflection of the culture, which suggested them to him. Inevitably, such an attitude emphasized the diversity rather than the identity of mankind as a whole, though Herder was quick to insist that no Volk could claim a position of superiority over any other. It also transferred political debate from the realm of abstract universal reason to a region in which half-conscious emotion, a spontaneous feeling for traditional ways of thought, too complicated and immediate for analysts, was not merely legitimate but inescapable. In both these respects, Herder had something in common with the conservative proponents of, quote, an organic conception of society, such as Burke. He himself, however, like Montesquieu, was dissatisfied with the society in which he lived. His theories reflected his own resentment at the pride and privilege of the German nobility. So far as others were concerned, their political implications were ambivalent. They could point either to narcissistic brooding over the historical past and an attempt to remain true to what were conceived as the sacred values of tradition. They might equally well be quoted to justify revolt against a culturally alien elite or the imposition of alien rule on a subject people. So, right here. The group of French writers often referred to as the philosophes, whose best-known representatives were Diderot, D'Alembert, and D'Holbach, and the separate group of physiocrats, who wrote mainly on economic subjects, were agreed in their conviction that the methods of the natural sciences could provide the solution to political and economic problems. Their writings tended to emphasize the efficient satisfaction of needs as the criterion of good government, and since government was a science, there was no reason why it should not share in the continuous progress of the sciences, and the lot of man become steadily more inviolable. The philosophers traced their pedigree back to Newton and Locke, although Newton himself would not have gone far. His disciples were convinced that the universe was a self-regulating system in which motion was inherent in matter, and there was no evidence for the existence of anything but matter. The laws which regulated this universe were discoverable by scientific observation, and once discovered, man could exploit them to his maximum advantage, as seamen exploited their knowledge of the trade winds. Since man was a part of the material whole, it was reasonable to assume that human society was governed by similar laws which could be similarly discovered and put to profitable use. From Locke, such writers learned that all our ideas are the product of physical sensation and reflection. Going beyond Locke, as they had advanced from Newton, they asserted that reflection was itself merely an involuntary comparison of sensations. Man, therefore, lived in a world of perceived phenomena, and any transcendental knowledge of a metaphysical kind was eternally denied to him. As D'Holbach wrote in his Système de la Nature, which perhaps sums up the attitudes of the school better than any other work, let him, quote, let him consent not to know causes which from his viewpoint are surrounded by an impenetrable veil. It is not given to man to know everything. He is not to know his own origin. It is not for him to penetrate into the essence of things, nor to uncover first principles. End quote. What was possible was to adjust himself and his society to the laws of nature, so as to attain what Chastellax described as, quote, the only end of all government, the greatest happiness of the greatest number of individuals. End quote. Utilitarian thinking of this kind was widespread throughout Britain and France, although it is generally associated in Britain with the name of Jeremy Bentham. It also influenced people like Johnson, who considered himself a Tory. Bonheur, or happiness, was the logical, objective, sensationalist psychology. Such a system implied the same kind of determinism for man that was attributed to the natural world of observed phenomena. D'Holbach insisted that the regulated movements that we see in the universe are the necessary consequences of the laws of matter. Order is merely what we perceive as the effect of a succession of movements. There could be no real disorder relative to the great whole where whatever happens is necessary and determined by laws that nothing can alter. End quote. Quote, the will of man, end quote, he said, is stirred up and secretly determined by external causes which produce changes within him. End quote. He quoted with approval Seneca's dictum. Quote, so that's all different language. Let's see. Quote, volentem ducunt fata nolentem trahunt. End quote. Priestley, whose sympathies were primarily directed towards this school of thought, managed to combine Christianity with both materialism and determinism, and specifically rejected, quote, the modern metaphysical hypothesis, end quote, that the will could be free in a world where everything else was determined. The search for happiness was itself one of the irresistible laws of nature. To quote D'Holbach again, quote, all our institutions, our reflections, our knowledge has for its only objective to procure for us the happiness towards which our own nature forces us ceaselessly to tend, end quote. Granted the assumptions, it was possible to make men happier and less antisocial by working on their environment. Whereas men like Montesquieu and Burke had regarded society as a living organism, the materialists tended to see it as part of a cosmic machine. This was to be thrown at them by their critics. Blake's images, when dealing with Newton and Locke, abounded in, quote, dark satanic mills, end quote, and, quote, cogs tyrannic moving by compulsion each other, end quote. The German Romantic writer Novalis wrote in 1799, hatred of religion turns the unending creative music of the cosmos into the monotonous rattling of a monstrous great mill, driven by the current of chance, and itself drifting on this current, a mill per se, without builder or miller, in truth, a genuine perpetuum mobile, a mill that grinds itself. The mechanistic viewpoint implied a unitary rather than a pluralist conception of society. If government was a science, the checks and balances that Montesquieu advocated were merely gratuitous sources of friction. This point of view was expressed most bluntly by the physiocrats. Quesnay, for example, declared roundly that, quote, the system of counterforces in government is a disastrous opinion, end quote. As in the case of the organic theorists, the political application of a relatively coherent body of doctrine permitted a good deal of variety. This was all the more understandable since the philosophers and the physiocrats were less concerned with constitutional forms than with the efficient execution of, quote, scientific policies. As Pope had written earlier in the century, for forms of government, let fools contest. Whatever is best administered is best. In 18th century Europe, corporate bodies had generally lost such representative character as they might once have possessed and had become bastions of privilege, where conservatism had frozen into immobility. Innovations were suspect to them on principle, especially when change was likely to diminish such relics of obstructive power as they still retained. An enlightened autocrat, with both the will and the power to enforce those policies on which the welfare of the community was thought to depend, seemed to offer higher rewards and fewer dangers. If the ruler himself appreciated the new science of government, he could not logically abdicate his own responsibility and become a capricious tyrant, as Mercier de la Riviere expressed it, in somewhat tortoise terms. Quote, personal despotism will be no more than the legal domination of the evidence of a basic order, end quote. Whether or not one opted for autocracy depended on a pragmatic assessment of political possibilities, and the choice would vary from one country to the next. In England, or even Burke would have taken up arms to defend the revolutionary settlement of 1688, and constitutional government provided effective national leadership, there was no need to turn to the kind of royal despotism that was alien to every Whig instinct. Whatever one's definition of happiness, unless one were Marquis de Sade, it did not involve the gratuitous infliction of pain. The 18th century rationalists waged a vigorous and on the whole successful war against cruelty and the superstition that often produced and justified it. Witchcraft trials came to an end, and in one country after another, judicial torture was abolished, and the death penalty reserved for the most serious offenses. In this respect, as in many others, the British pursued a course of their own, pioneers in the abolition of torture and relatively humane in their method of executing the death sentence. They continued to create new capital crimes throughout the century, especially where offenses against property were concerned. Perhaps this confirmed the argument of the physiocrats that enlightened policies were more likely to come from a relatively disinterested autocrat than from what Coleridge was to commend as the, quote, representation of interest, end quote. The efficient humanity of the Enlightenment was also to be seen in more effective provision for the sick and destitute, which probably contributed to a general rise in population during the second half of the century. Famine was still possible, but it was becoming an exceptional rather than a periodic occurrence. And in normal times, mortality was less directly dependent on the harvest. The humane institutions which made poverty less lethal reflected the genuine concern of the philosophers and their followers for the general well-being of the community at large. The gradual decline of the, quote, Gothic barbarity that they thought they could perceive in their society encouraged them to believe that they stood at the beginning of a new age continuous moral and material progress. There were, in fact, reasonable grounds for Diderot's assertion that, quote, people's way of life has become more humane because of the decline of the prejudices that maintained its former ferocity, end quote. Even in Spain, the burning of heretics had at last stopped. Although the word progress was not often used by itself as a self-explanatory description of the tendency of things to improve, the idea of continuous linear development towards a society in which more wealth would be evenly distributed was widespread among those who thought primarily in political rather than economic terms. Condorcet and Chastellux wrote general histories of civilization to demonstrate that scientific rationalism had rescued man from the obscurantism and superstition of the Middle Ages and established a sure basis for continuous social development. As Condorcet expressed it, quote, just as mathematics and the physical sciences perfect the crafts that we use to satisfy our simplest needs, is it not equally inherent in the necessary natural order that the progress of the moral and political sciences should have the same effect on the motives which direct our feelings and actions? End quote. In view of a certain tendency to dismiss the optimism of the Enlightenment as the superficial effusion of a well-heeled salon society, it is worth pointing out that the Condorcet was himself fleeing from the terror, which was to drive him to suicide, when he wrote, quote, no limit has been set to the perfecting of human faculties. The progress of this perfectibility, henceforth independent of any force that would try to stop it, will continue as long as the globe on which nature has set us. No doubt the pace of this progress will vary, but there will be no turning back. End quote. It is impossible to begin to understand how the revolutionary crisis appeared to contemporaries unless one is aware of this widely held conviction that a new age of unprecedented and unlimited improvement had already dawned. For men such as these, tradition was suspect in prescription prejudice. Chastellux amused himself and his readers with a brilliant caricature of, quote, the good old days, end quote, which could only be regretted by those who had no idea of what they actually were. A school of thought that emphasized happiness as the goal of human activity and assumed poverty to be the main cause of both suffering and crime was naturally led to attach the greatest importance to the means by which the wealth of a community could be increased. One of the main objectives of Diderot's Encyclopédie was to disseminate technological information. It was therefore not surprising that economics, as an autonomous, quote, science, should have originated as a branch of the Enlightenment. The basic assumptions of the economists were the same as those of the philosophers. The circulation of wealth was regulated by Newtonian laws, which man could discover and exploit but not alter. Material and moral progress were inseparable, and whatever proved conducive to the former must be in accordance with the latter. What might appear as conflict from the perspective of the individual observer was a part of some wider natural or providential harmony. Those whose attention was concentrated on economic questions tended, however, to assume that the multiplication of wealth was the prime, if not the only factor in the promotion of human happiness, and to subordinate politics to economics. Although philosophers and economists started from similar premises, their paths diverged on the theories of the latter came to assume a chilly and inhuman rigor, in marked contrast to the passionate humanity of those who thought mainly in social and political terms. Economic liberalism, as expounded by the physiocrats in France and by Adam Smith in Great Britain, is generally regarded as a doctrine of emancipation. In one sense, this is true, since the liberals aim to free the owners of capital from restraints imposed on their activities by traditional practices that have often outlived their usefulness. Property, at least, was to be, quote, freed from restriction, but it is perhaps more helpful if one is to place the new theories in their social context to realize that economic liberalism was an extreme form of determinism, even if the end product was part of some providential order. Adam Smith made this clear, quote, every individual exerts himself to find out the most advantageous employment for whatever his capital can command. The study of his own advantage necessarily leads him to prefer what is most advantageous to society, end quote. Economic liberalism appeared somewhat less benign to those without capital. Human labor was assumed to be a commodity whose price, like that of any other commodity, was determined by the iron law of supply and demand. Free competition, it was assumed, would fix the price of labor at the, quote, cost of production, end quote, of the labor. In other words, at the bare minimum required for the subsistence of himself and his family. Economic progress was not merely possible, but automatic, if the state would abstain from misguided interference and allow the division of labor and the extension of markets to develop unimpeded. But the new wealth reserved for the owners of capital, while the great majority with nothing to offer but their labor, were excluded from the banquet that nature had prepared for their superiors. The new doctrine was not merely inherently anti-egalitarian, by making the poverty of the many the necessary price of the enrichment of the minority. It hardened the hearts of the educated against the voice of humanity. Burke's thoughts and details on scarcity offers a good indication of the kind of attitude that ensued. Quote, labor is a commodity, and as such an article of trade. If I am right in this notion, then labor must be subject to all the laws and principles of trade. The impossibility of the subsistence of a man who carries his labor to market is totally beside the question in this way of viewing it. The only question is, what is it worth to the buyer? End quote. Burke then calls on his readers. Manfully to resist the very first idea, speculative or practical, that it is within the competence of government, taken as government, or even of the rich as rich, to supply to the poor those necessaries which it has pleased the divine providence for a while to withhold from them. We, the people, ought to be made sensible that it is not the breaking of the laws of commerce, which are the laws of nature, and consequently the laws of God, that we are to place our hope of softening the divine displeasure. It is important to recognize that on this issue, political radicals agreed with Burke. Priestley, for example, wrote that, quote, the greater in the provision that is made for the poor, the more poor there will be to avail themselves of it, end quote. Whereas traditional Christian theology had commended poverty and regarded riches as suspect, the providence of the economic liberals held that the acquisition of wealth by industry, commerce, or agriculture was itself proof of social utility. In everyday life, riches had no doubt always tended to confer respectability. Now they implied civic virtue as well as superiors were also ipso facto, quote, betters. Property took the place of people. Priestley thought, quote, persons of considerable fortune will necessarily have the most property at stake and will therefore be the most interested in the fate of their country, end quote. Coleridge claimed that, quote, from the earliest manhood, i.e. even in his radical days, it was axiom in politics with me that in every country where property prevailed, property must be the grand basis of government, and that government was best, in which the power or political influence of the individual was in proportion to his property, end quote. A new, quote, natural hierarchy of property was therefore substituted for a traditional order based on birth. However logical the substitution it was, nevertheless to be a long time before the old prejudices yielded to the new, and throughout the period covered by this book, the successful merchant or manufacturer tended to aspire to gentility by converting his money into land and himself into a squire. Priestley, who condemned the old prejudice against trade, revealed the limits of his own emancipation when he went on to say, quote, by commerce, numbers acquire the wealth and spirit of princes, end quote. Only in Britain and the Netherlands did these economic theories bear much relationship to the actual structure of society. Elsewhere, a traditional social and economic order prevailed, and insofar as the doctrines of the Enlightenment had any practical application, this was in the main confined to administrative and judicial reform and to philanthropic activities. Such doctrines commended themselves especially to autocratic rulers, eager to increase the control of the central government at the expense of privileged and particularist classes and corporations, so far as the resistance of the latter would permit. The situation was transformed by the French Revolution, which for the first time in modern European history transferred effective political power to an assembly elected by the majority of the adult male population. For the first time, it became possible to associate the idea of scientific government with that representative government. This was not the least of the distinctive characteristics of the French Revolution. Any intellectual movement is likely to generate a reaction against itself. Let's see, says Rousseau. One second. Okay, sorry about that. Any intellectual movement is likely to generate a reaction against itself, as its initial heresies become familiar commonplaces. What was perhaps peculiar in the case of the Enlightenment was that the reaction developed at the same time as the original movement. This was not merely due to the personality of Rousseau. Others, including his Bête Noire, Helvetius, also pointed to the aridity of social life and the artificiality of its values, and turned from the logic of the majority to the imaginative intuition of the misunderstood genius, seeing nature as a source of personal inspiration rather than a demonstration of providential order, and commending to their readers the uncomfortable example of an idealized Sparta. If, both then and now, such attitudes tended to be associated primarily with Rousseau himself, this is partly because he developed them most systematically and with unequaled elegance, and partly because he alone transformed his actual way of life in accordance with such principles, and advertised the fact that with boastful humility that was quite unique. One of the fundamental tenets of Rousseau's philosophy was the freedom of the individual, both in the philosophical sense of the freedom of his will and in the more practical sense that resolute man could defy social convention and live in the way he considered right. This freedom rested not on any logical demonstration, but on each man's immediate recognition of the moral imperative of his own conscience. Quote, I hear much argument against man's freedom, and I, despite such sophistry, one of these arguers, can prove to me, as much as he likes, that I am not free, inner feeling, more powerful than all his arguments, refutes them all the time. End quote. Rousseau was at considerable pains to defend what he considered the legitimate claims of reason. This was partly to challenge Roman Catholic dogma, which he attacked as vigorously as any of his contemporaries. His point was that, quote, reason could be twisted to justify whatever suited one's own inclinations. That the identity of what Pope had called, quote, self-love and social, end quote, however true it might be in some ultimate perspective, did not prevent the two from conflicting in everyday life. That when such conflicts arose, conscience was the only guide to truth, and the only spur to the discharge of unwelcome duties. Quote, whatever I feel to be right is right. What I feel to be wrong is wrong. The best of all casuists is the conscience. Reason deceives us only too often, and we have all earned too well the right to reject it. But conscience never deceives. Rousseau's conception of nature as emotional communion with Providence or God, his own passionate nature and his superb command of language, gave to his writing a uniquely moving quality. It was in a sense pulpit oratory of a kind that had rarely been heard since the previous century. His religious temperament, divorced from any formal theology and concerning itself with man's problems and secular society, made him the most effective preacher of his age, besides earning him persecution by both Catholics and Calvinists. His books, particularly his novel, La Nouvelle Héloïse, reached an immense public, and his followers learned from him, not so much a system as a kind of faith. Much of the power of his writing is lost in translation. But the following example may perhaps convey, however feebly, some of the emotional force which he communicated. Quote, conscience, divine instinct, immortal and heavenly voice, sure guide to men who, ignorant and blinkered, are still intelligent and free, infallible judge of good and ill, who shapes men in the image of God. It is you who form the excellence of man's nature and the morality of his actions. Without you, I feel nothing within that raises me above the beast, nothing but the melancholy privilege of staying from error to error, relying on an understanding without rule and a reason without principle." End quote. The political implications of Rousseau's faith are frequently misunderstood by relating them exclusively to his brief treatise on political theory, Du Contrat Social, and interpreting this in the light of the 20th century. To appreciate their contemporary significance, one must look at his work as a whole. By temperament and conviction, Rousseau was a Democrat. For the followers of Montesquieu and Burke, political rights tended to be founded on prescriptions and to belong to collectivities rather than to individuals. The writers of the Enlightenment assumed that only the educated could lead the forces of reason into battle against superstition and a blind attachment to the forces of the past. Conscience, however, did not depend on education. Indeed, the promptings of the heart were only too likely to be stifled by the acquired sophistication of the gentleman. In his first major work, which won him the prize offered by the Dijon Academy in 1750, Rousseau had already established his position. Quote, "O virtue, sublime knowledge of the simple soul, does it take so much labor and preparation to know you? Are your principles not engraved in every heart? Is it not enough to understand your laws, that we should look within ourselves and listen to the voice of conscience when our passions are silent?" End quote. Rousseau's basic convention, that in essence all men were equal as free moral agents, although not wholly unfamiliar to Protestant Europe, was a revolutionary political doctrine. Its implicit endorsement in France in 1792 was another of the distinctive characteristics of the French Revolution. Since from this point of view, the objective of civil society was not the material well-being, but the moral welfare of its constituent members. Politics took precedence over economics. A community might therefore disregard economic laws which had no sanctity in themselves, and were merely means to particular ends, and redistribute wealth or regulate the use of property in accordance with overriding moral criteria. Rousseau himself made no explicit statement to this effect. In Du Contrat Social, he, like Marx, assumed that the prior existence of a certain type of economy would be conducive to the kind of society of which he approved. But since economic laws were not sacrosanct, and the institution of private property had taken the place of the fall in Rousseau's account of the origins of human depravity, it was not surprising if one or two of his followers during the French Revolution decided that wealth, with its potential power to corrupt, must be reserved for the virtuous. Rousseau went further than condemning the tendency to worship economic progress as an end in itself. He regarded the development of civilized society as a calamity, which had deprived man of his original moral dignity. I just want to pause right there. So it says, he says that must be reserved for the virtuous. So that wealth with its potential power to corrupt must be reserved for the virtuous. And so, there's this thing that where ownership comes into play, ownership over production. This is during the bourgeois times, they're coming out of the church state, that virtuous was like only seen as within the state. You could only be virtuous like if you were for your state, and so they're saying like, okay, well, if we give the production to the people, we give the working people their ownership over their own production. If we do that, well then they might use it against the state or whatever. However, they don't realize that it's the production that continues society and not the state. So, if people are going to carry out the production, if that's what's going to continue society so that society can accelerate and develop, the state can't be in the way of that, But if a state plays its part in that and just, protects their ownership as the workers, they're going to want that state more than a state that says, okay, you don't own this anymore. That's the revolution itself. It's how they see virtuous. Virtuous, they say, can be up to how somebody sees it or not, So what virtuous is during this time is going to be like, oh, they're not going to betray the state. They're going to be patriotic about their own state, and they're seeing the state as the country or the nation itself, and not the people that carry out the production. It's kind of the backwardness of, I guess Western society that kind of stuck with the bourgeois revolutions and the bourgeois cultures like this, even though different individual liberties were granted finally. There wasn't, what was the moral infinity of God, it became the moral infinity of ourselves. But the state, they still don't see the state as just a physical being made up of people. You know, it's only as morally infinite as the people who it answers to with the ownership over production, right? Who it protects production, you know. Okay, I'm gonna get back into this. Sorry, I had to take a pause there. I saw Marx there, and I'm like, oh, I gotta say something. It made me want to say things about it. You can see how virtuous was seen during this time, you know, 1776 through 1815. This is right at the time that Marx is about to begin. You know, Marx is all about this. He didn't want to about this kind of stuff here. You know, the independence from the corrupted church state. You know, he just took things a little farther and said, hey, look, you know, if somebody's born without property, you know, they're going to be continued to whoever owns, you know, their labor, they're going to keep using their labor against them. You know, they're never going to be able to gain their own ideals. They're never going to be able to do it. It's still an oppressive society. So let's go ahead and get back into this. Quote, for the philosopher, let's see. He regarded Rousseau went further than condemning the tendency to worship economic progress as an end in itself. He regarded the development of civilized society as a calamity, which had deprived man of his original moral dignity. Quote, for the philosopher, it is iron and corn that have civilized men and led the human race to perdition. End quote. It was too late to return to the lost simplicity, but at least one could preserve from temptation those whose humble social status kept them closest to nature. Quote, the great maxim of Madame de Vomar, the heroine of La Nouvelle Heloise, is therefore not to favor any change of social status, but to make each happy in his own rank. End quote. This, he concedes, may deprive society of talent, but, quote, good and simple people are not in need of so much talent. As they become corrupted, their talents develop as though to supplement the qualities they are losing, end quote. Paternalism of this kind is so often a mere rationalization of privilege that one must point out, in fairness to Rousseau, that he himself tried to practice in his own life what he preached in his books. Moreover, those in need had more to hope from him than from the economic liberals. He considered that the destitute were entitled to charity and attacked the economist's inclination to, quote, to smother the heart's natural tendency to pity and harden it into insensibility, end quote. When he came to the question of political sovereignty and du contrat social, Rousseau laid himself open to the charge of totalitarianism. The social contract by which individuals were deemed to have formed themselves into a community involved, quote, the complete alienation by each associate of the totality of his rights to the community as a whole, end quote. Henceforth, the community was sovereign, in moral as well as political questions. The object of each of its members was to discover the common interest, what Rousseau called the, quote, general will. Assuming, as Rousseau sometimes did, that in a specific instance the general will was represented by a majority vote, the minority must admit their mistake and wholeheartedly adopt the policy they had begun by mistakenly opposing. Since there could be no moral law superior to the common interest, the general will, if it could be known, was automatically infallible. Quote, the sovereign, i.e. the general will, by the mere fact of existing, is always what it ought to be, end quote. One could illustrate this moral totalitarianism implicit in du contrat social by the example of the way in which Madame de Vomar ruled her manorial estate, whose servants were expected to denounce each other to their mistress. One may also add Rousseau's repeated praise of Sparta as a warrior state, suspicious of its neighbors. Quote, all patriots are stern towards foreigners. Foreigners are merely men, i.e. not citizens. They are nothing in the eyes of the patriot. Beware of those cosmopolitans who look far afield in their books for the duties which they disdain to discharge in their immediate surroundings, end quote. It is not surprising if all this should have led some of Rousseau's modern readers to regard him as one of the ancestors of totalitarianism. If one tries, however, to not to defend him, but to discover what he actually intended and what his contemporaries thought that he meant, the result is somewhat different. Despite the incautious language of du contrat social, it is inconceivable that the prophet of the inner voice should have advocated the complete sacrifice of the individual conscience to the moral standards of the community. His meaning was rather that society as a whole must decide where its interests lie. And once it has so decided, the public interest takes precedence over the individual convenience and traditional privilege. Rousseau was sufficiently typical of his age to believe in the existence of a providential harmony which would ensure that the conscience of the citizen could never prompt him to tyrannize a minority within his own society or to exploit other nations to his own advantage. His Spartan militarism appears less sinister if one remembers that he had always in mind his native city-state of Geneva, which was not generally regarded as constituting much of a threat to the European balance of power. Nevertheless, the political message of Rousseau, with its emphasis on the destruction of all intermediate loyalties between citizen and state, and the absolute sovereignty of state power, did seem to 18th century readers to justify democratic absolutism, if not the moral totalitarianism of a later age. Rousseau's thought was developed mainly in Germany, and it was not so much its political as its moral content that appealed to Kant and his successors. Kant himself wrote, quote, "I once thought that it was only knowledge that constituted the dignity of man, and I despised the ignorant masses. But Rousseau set me on the right road. I have learned to honor man for himself, and I should think myself less useful than a simple artisan, if I did not believe my ideas would serve to restore the rights of humanity." End quote. He translated Rousseau's antithesis between the individual conscience and the convictions of society in the metaphysical terms. For him, knowledge of the external world referred merely to phenomena, sense impressions, that were only accessible to the mind as interpreted by the material organs of perception, which therefore conveyed no direct knowledge of the essence of the thing perceived. Kant surrendered this world of phenomena to the determinism of scientific laws. The mind, however, possessed immediate and absolute knowledge of its own operations, and the, quote, categorical imperative of conscience provided an infallible guide to moral action. Kant himself insisted on the existence of an external world, however imperfect its perception by the human observer. Nevertheless, he initiated a shift away from the world of events towards self-contemplation, which was to become more and more pronounced. Rousseau, despite some wavering, on the whole maintained that, quote, "truth is in things and not in my mind which judges them," end quote. Kant removed this safeguard with results that will be discussed in the last chapter. So Rousseau kind of turned into a materialist, it seems. Or it was kind of a materialist. Interesting. Okay. The heritage of Rousseau, multiple and diverse as it was, included several common characteristics, which gave it an identity of its own. Chief among these was the insistence that the basic concern of man was his own moral improvement, which was not necessarily related to his material progress. The reform of public and private morality was the concern of the state. It was not to be delegated to the church. The actual ideas of real people were a good deal more complicated and often less consistent than the schematic description would suggest. Few writers, if any, could be placed squarely within any one of these three, quote, schools. German idealists tended to hold an organic view of society that owed something to Burke. Burke himself borrowed his economic theories from the liberals, and a materialist like D'Holbach could invoke nature and language that might pass for Rousseau's. Our concern in this book is not so much with the writers themselves as with the political influence of their ideas. In very general terms, there were basically three main ways in which contemporaries regarded the nature of man and the function of society. If these distinctions are kept in mind, they will help towards an understanding of how a period of political crisis appeared to the men whose action determined the course that events were to take. Okay, so there is the first chapter of this book, The First European Revolution by Norman Hampson. It's kind of exciting to get into this, you know. So yeah, this is that's what this is about. Basically, just the European Revolution altogether, the bourgeois era of revolution. This is during the time of the American Revolution as well. It kind of set this off. There's always kind of this global revolution that happens once the world is kind of understood as what it is. A lot of cool pictures in here too. I'd like to get these around and stuff. This book I have, some of them have been highlighted on. I don't know where that came from, but the pictures look kind of funny in some of them, but not all of them are highlighted. So yeah, well, thank y'all for tuning in. Follow me online, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. Well, not TikTok, Tumblr, Medium. I'm off TikTok now for some reason. It's weird. But follow me there. Marx is solid, all of those. I'm thinking about starting a new page. Maybe for the ones who aren't so familiar with Marxism or aren't just ready for Marxism just yet. They want to, understand a little bit more about, the vast history of the Democratic Republic. And it's, and from there, when you get into Marxist revolutions, you begin to understand that the Democratic Republic is not an ideal, but it is a real physical thing that exists in the people outside of the state. It is not an ideal within a state. But we'll get into that later. I might start a page that's kind of more for that, so kind of giving an understanding to people who, so that they're, our society, our government has sponsored a lot to have this hysteria around the word Marx. I like to call this word worship. You say Marx, communism. These things are bad. They're scary. But you'll hear about Marx and communism in this book. I mean, they say the first communist, I forgot his name, but it was somebody in the French Revolution. It was a communist. I mean, had the basic ideas of communism at that time. So it's just history. It's just, you're never going to get a spell casted upon you by reading Marx. Marx will not cast a spell upon you. It's a silly thing from the church state that even the French Revolution was trying to get rid of, but didn't do so well, is that, reading books does not give you demons. It's not going to give you an evil spirit. If Marx is so evil and communism is so evil, then read it and figure out what it is so you can recognize it, right? And the same to the communists. I've read fascist writings. You should read fascist writings because that's much more practical than when fascism shows up at your door and you don't even know it's there. They always say you're going to fight fascism. How? You won't even read fascism. You're scared of fascism's words, So yeah, you should read fascism. If you're that susceptible to fascism, it's awful. It's absolutely terrible, But you should be able to realize what it is. When the state becomes the ideal above all, it's a mystical. It's where idealism. We never get out of idealism, but the state falls apart. So as this, the empire stops expanding. So what happens is they play on that idealism. And Mussolini had to do something where he went around telling people that their nation was in their spirit. It was deep inside of them. It was this superstitious thing. And it's kind of what we see here, kind of what we're still in the United States is this potential that, if we don't get out of the idealist concept that our state is morally infinite and our ideals are infinite and that they can't be, if we don't tell people to confide their ideals outside of the state among the people who carry out the production, then the state will alienate the classes out through this cult-like idealism that comes in. And that's called fascism. So you should definitely read fascism. If you're scared to read fascism, you're going to be that shaken up by fascism just by reading it. You're not going to fight it. We can't confide in you to fight it if you won't even read the book and see what it is. You're encouraging people to read fascism. We're here at the end of this hour-long thing, and if you're a communist, reading this, this is, fascism took a lot of inspiration from these bourgeois revolutions, which is the government that we're still living in today. In this very first page, you see a tying up of sticks. That's what the word fascist means. It's a tying up of sticks. So, that's what I'm saying. You should always read. Always read. You can't read enough. Read. Read more words. Read everything you possibly can. So practical. Prepares your mind for what you have to do next. War is it comes down to people. It comes down to the people's consciousness. That's what war is. That's who wins. Is the people conscious of how things are and what things are and what people are and what the earth is and what governments are and what production is. It's all the science of war. It really is, because we are constantly in a struggle. And our struggle is against colonialism. So, particularly, mine is. I mean, I can't speak on everybody's behalf here, but colonialism is, a pseudo-democratic republic where the democratic republic had not been realized in physical terms. So, okay, I'm gonna hop off here. Y'all have a great day, and Dodada Goy.